Okay, so I'm Leon Cochin, and I'll be introducing our final two speakers. And as Maura said, we have two excellent speakers to close out this conference. So our next speaker is Dr. Stephen McGurk. Steve is the Vice President of Programs at the International Development Research Center, or IDRC, in Ontario, Canada, and he'll tell us a little more about that organization. He asked me to keep his introduction short, so I'll just touch on a few points. Received his PhD from Stanford at their Food Research Institute. He's an economist and an expert on China, and he has an impressive record of accomplishment in the field of rural development. So for more than 30 years, he has studied Asia's rural development. Prior to his current job with the IDRC, he's held several other high-profile jobs with them in various areas in China. He's also worked with the Ford Foundation in Beijing and with the World Bank, and also has taught at my undergraduate alma mater, UC Berkeley. And so I welcome him with the title of his talk, Megatrends Driving Agri-Food Research for the Development in Low and Middle Income Countries. Steve?
It's a pleasure, particularly a pleasure to have accepted Maurice Maloney's and Wilf Keller's very kind invitation to be a sponsor, to have some of the research that we've supported actually featured here. Teresa Mosquera's work on yellow potatoes in Colombia, Shalim Bayen's work in southern Ethiopia on pulses, and Manish Raizada's work on sustainable intensification kits in Nepal were all featured here in talks over the last 2 days, and we're delighted that we were given an opportunity to do that. What I'm going to talk about is, however, not particularly science-based, a bit more policy-based. And so I hope you will grant me a little indulgence, given that we did come with 3 science-based presentations during this conference. So the International Development Research Center is a Canadian Crown Corporation. Since we're being webcast, many people may not know. We were founded by 2 prime ministers, Lester Pearson and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and Lester Pearson was the first board chair of IDRC. So that dates us to 1970. Agriculture was where we began working and where we continue to work. David Hopper was IDRC's first president. I suspect a number of you have known David over the years. He just died this year, but had worked with Norman Borlaug on the Green Revolution in India, where in fact he met Mike Pearson, who was traveling at Indira Gandhi's invitation to try to understand the famine in 1965 in India. And he met the future president of IDRC there working on the Green Revolution, who persuaded the prime minister that science and technology had a contribution to play in addressing famine. And when Mike Pearson retired from the Canadian government, he ensured that this new organization, a one-of-a-kind, the International Development Research Center, was established to, in fact, provide support to do precisely that from the international assistance envelope. Our focus is on very applied, last-mile research support, largely to institutions in the developing world, also Canadian institutions and a few international institutions, but 85+% of all of our research support goes directly to developing country institutions. Some of the CG institutes, you're represented here, get a little bit of support from us. Roots tubers for example, being an example of a CRP that we have invested in, among others. About 10 years ago, we had focused very much on ongoing devolution, governmental devolution in rural areas across the developing world. And that was raising a number of very real questions about how agricultural extension systems and agricultural research systems at the national level could survive, as most of the resources to support those institutions had melted away in these devolution efforts. Because of the huge crunch in most of this infrastructure and institutions, increasingly communities themselves at a very local level had to take over some of these functions, these extension functions, and even community-based research projects. And that's most of what we did, was try to figure out, with moribund extension systems, what could we do? In those days, private extension systems were just embryonic in most of the poor developing countries of the world. They're stronger now, but they were extraordinarily weak then. However, one thing we noticed as we were helping agricultural research stations and extension systems try to get out of their institutions and into the field and see what communities were doing to find their own solutions was that there was a lot of low-hanging fruit that wasn't being picked up. There were lots of interesting findings in those ag research stations and in agricultural extension systems that was not getting out to communities. And the traditional method of pushing them out had long since lost any value or traction amongst the communities that might take advantage of them. So while we were trying to deal with this policy conundrum of the collapse of extension systems and the collapse of national agricultural research systems, we were increasingly aware that there's all this stuff, interesting little pieces of work on indigenous vegetables, on new types of millet processing that's not being picked up. It's not getting out there. Our governors were particularly acute in saying, why don't you actually fund some innovation work? So that's what we approached the Canadian government with in 2008. And we said, we know you're skeptical about research. We know that research takes a long time to actually get to the point where it gets out to communities. It's particularly the case in developing countries where most of the institutions that you could build upon typically are very weak, and particularly weak at the level in which you need them to be strong. The Canadian government said, no, the research will take too long. The international assistance envelope has to show results in actual changes in people's livelihoods in 3 years. Can't be done. Can't be done. We said, give us 5 years. Consider it a 10-year program of innovation, and we'll do it in 2 5-year chunks. We persuaded them to give it a try, but they were deeply skeptical. And every time we had a joint conversation with the Canadian government, it was very much, why can't we get results next year after 18 months of on-the-field research work? So it was a real tension for us, but we persevered. And that's work that I want to talk to you about today. So most of my talk is framed by a discussion of big changes, some of which we explored very much through this program of innovation over the last 8 years, and some of which comes out of work that we've been supporting for much longer periods of time, looking at longer-term institutional and organizational change affecting rural communities. I'm really not going to talk a lot about this. Most of this has been already better brought out by others. But I did want to add this little piece, which has not come out well, and it's quite important for rural areas. And I have to catch up on my little pad here, so, okay. So the dramatic change across the developing world, and increasingly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, is towards a much broader pattern of urbanization than is commonly understood. So currently, about half of the world's urban population resides in towns and small and medium-sized cities up to about 500,000 people. So that's 27% of the world's population lives in small towns or medium-sized cities. And these are the cities that are the most connected to rural areas. These are, in fact, potential engines of change for rural areas. These are the areas where rural people migrate to. These are the areas that provide peripheral health services to rural people. These are the areas that rural people leaving for service jobs and for government jobs will look first. And increasingly, it's difficult to talk about rural areas as being disconnected and isolate, because so many of the rural areas are now deeply connected to urban areas, both in terms of very real physical connections to small and medium-sized cities, but also through migration to even farther away cities. So there's a number of important implications, and this came out of a series of work that we commissioned around the world on rural inclusion, done by Julio Verdeguer of the RIMISP network, in case anyone's interested. So first, rural areas are diversifying, as are rural household and community livelihood strategies. Agricultural structural transformation is underway almost everywhere. And that means agriculture is increasingly less important to national economies relative to services, and in some places, mostly Asia, manufacturers. The growing integration of different kinds of contemporary agriculture with manufacturing and services and value chains strongly influenced, if not dominated, by intermediate and downstream actors with an urban base is now fundamentally a feature of the rural world, all over the world. And that's been assisted by very large improvements in connectivity in rural areas, both physical connectivity and phone connectivity. And of course, through migration, which has persisted, which has very real drivers and consequences, both for rural and urban development. And of course, also, as I mentioned, by the greater importance of subnational governments as globally decentralization policies have become quite central. So the diversification of rural economies and rural households, in turn, has resulted in off-farm incomes being increasingly dominant. Not farm incomes, off-farm incomes are now dominant to rural households. These are very broad numbers, I appreciate, and sub-Saharan Africa is not quite there relative to Asia and Latin America, but this is changing very fast. And so there are multiple income strategies that households have adopted in this very diverse world. Forward and backward linkages to agricultural production, responding to urban demand, other rural industries, mining, oil and gas, et cetera, and other rural-based activities, tourism. The Minister of Canada's International Development and La Francophonie, Marie-Claude Bibeau, before she came back into government, she ran a tourism industry in Sherbrooke, where my mother is from. And if you don't know l'Estrie, southeastern Quebec, it used to be farmland. Nowadays, northern New England and southeastern Quebec, you are hard-pressed to find a lot of farmland. It's mostly leisure activities nowadays, unlike Saskatchewan. So, where am I? Two different machines at the same time. It's probably too much for me to handle. So you have my apologies. I will sort it out. So those rising incomes have led to a range of changes which a number of speakers have spoken to today, as well as yesterday. Interestingly, the double burden is increasingly prominent. Mortality rates in developing countries now no longer feature communicable disease in the top 10 factors for mortality. In the top 10, it's largely traffic accidents and chronic disease. It looks like North America. Cancers, respiratory illness, hypertension. These are these double burdens. Okay, I'm going to skip the next one. Or am I? Yes, I am. So another major trend has been diversification of smallholder farming systems, which follows on very naturally from the previous discussion. No surprise, a number of researchers, particularly in the UK and the US, are questioning the narrow focus on small-scale agriculture for growth in favor of other models such as large-scale commercial producers and mixed small and large-scale models. We, however, continue to believe that a small-scale focus on small-scale farmers is very important, and that technologies that can provide for more efficient and more commercial small-scale farming are going to be very important. I don't think I'm going to talk much to this. It's just to give you a sense of the kinds of details of changes that are underway and the types of motivations and constraints facing smallholders in this transition towards more commercial smallholding. And as I said, these kinds of diversification patterns are very suggestive of the kinds of immediate applications that will be of value to diversifying smallholders. So clearly, things that allow households to take a portfolio approach to their incomes, including remittances from cities and from work in other countries. This results in a greater propensity for more specialized approaches to agriculture. Agriculture, again, is not the only source of income. And diversity has a much greater value than having a larger farm in many cases. And so the role of mechanization, particularly tools and machines that are appropriate for women to use, becomes increasingly important for increasing productivity of small farms. So just a few examples here: a corn sheller, planting tools, dehuller for small millets, and a cell phone weather app. Here's another example. Here's slightly larger smallholder commercialization. This is an effort that came to us from a group at the University of Agriculture in Tamil Nadu in southern India, and the Mango Industry Association of Sri Lanka, who wanted to work with Guelph University, who'd been working on cherries and soft fruit preservation. So here, mangoes, you probably don't know, but it's very difficult to get Alfonsos in Delhi nowadays. My favorite mangoes are available really only for about a 2-week window, and they're very expensive to get. So I basically have to load up the back of my car with crate after crate, and of course I have to give most of them away because they rot very fast. And those are only the ones that actually made it to Delhi. So huge amount of losses. And here are losses that are not economic losses. They're not fed to other animals. They're not used in any other processing. They're dead weight loss. So here was an example where we adapted hexanol, that smell. For me, the smell I get when I mow grass, that's hexanol. Adapting hexanol to spraying on soft fruits has proven fairly dramatically effective in lengthening the time to ripening of soft fruits. So a final element in the diversification of smallholder farming has been a fairly dramatic technological change in logistics and supply management systems. For example, and I was, before I came back to Canada, and at the end of 2012, I spent 7 years in India, so I have a lot of examples from India, so you'll excuse me. Between 2004 and 2013, India's modern food sector grew 45% a year, every year for a decade. Now, granted, from a very low level, but that kind of transformative growth, 45% a year growth every year for a decade, has been a driver of absolute change in rural areas. There's also been a growth of processing, agribusiness, both in modern and in traditional retail, centralized procurement for supermarkets that are increasingly evident across cities in the developing world. And of course, related to that, integrated packing, grading, processing, transport, and logistics, including warehousing finance, cold chains, and even commodity exchanges. So in 2012, the government of Ethiopia set up the first commodity exchange in Africa. So for smallholders, what are the implications? They need to be prepared to raise the standards on the farms to meet the needs of these increasingly integrated food chains. So I'm not going to say much about this. We've heard, again, much more about this. Just give you a couple of examples of work, again, that we financed through this innovation program. So here in the Sahel, basically, these are microdosing of fertilizer compared with coupled with water harvesting programs. This has proved extraordinarily effective, and it's now been coupled with efforts in Nigeria to grow indigenous vegetables and reintroduce the marketing of indigenous vegetables into Nigerian cities, combined with microdosing of fertilizers and water So in this case, clearly less energy use, also very cheap input use, so that for very poor farmers and very small scale farmers, this is doable. Here's another example of work that Shalim and others talked about at this meeting. I'm not going to talk more about it. And yet another example, how do I go back? There we go, that Manish Razaida spoke to yesterday. So again, I'm not going to speak to any of those, and I'm almost done. So here was the skepticism that we faced from the Canadian government when we began this innovations program. We've heard incredible ideas and absolutely transformative technological visions, but we've also heard of this skepticism over the complex, very process-oriented and anecdotal nature of most development research. That is not the agricultural research so much, but the development research. And concerns very much that research takes too long to show results. As I said, a failure to benefit many people, particularly poor people, from research, and research projects that remain islands of success within their local context. So why do we then need attention to research? I'm clearly preaching to the choir, but I would say from the development perspective that there's major gaps in understanding how we get new technologies, tools, and innovations into the hands of poor smallholders and pastoralists. We need more innovations and technologies, particularly those that are not around the major export crops of wheat, rice, and maize, where there exists some national agricultural research capacity, and there remains, and in some cases are now new private extension systems that can work alongside the national systems that are still been able to maintain themselves. I don't think I'm going to say much more about the skepticism, except to say that the real problem here is taking these small-scale innovations with poorer farmers to some level of scale. And I have to say that we deliberately targeted a certain kind of scale. We took a look at most of the major international foundation and bilateral support to scale efforts, the Feed the Futures of USAID, the Grand Challenges of Gates. And when they were taking things to scale, it was largely with multinational corporations. So the Del Montes, the PepsiCos for northern Ethiopia, to expand chickpea production for export to the Middle East. Very helpful, very useful, but we felt it had one major deficiency, and that was it didn't really build up the private sector in those national settings. And without the private sector as a key partner to public sector efforts in many of these developing countries, they're going to be in trouble, and in trouble for a long time to come. And simply bringing in the PepsiCos of the world wasn't going to help address that very much. It might a little bit, but we had another example, which I don't have in front of me, which I will talk about very quickly. So Danone runs most of the yogurt business in South Africa and in urban East Africa. And they do it with very large industrial processing of yogurt in urban, large-scale industrial plants. There are no ties to rural farm chains. There are no stimulus whatsoever to milk producers in these countries. There is a complete disconnect. So despite yogurt industries going to scale in South Africa and parts of urban East Africa, in fact, they haven't dramatically changed the nature of processing of milk products. So this particular example was another one that we struggled with. This one is reducing livestock losses in Africa through the development of multivalent, cheap, and temperature-stable vaccines. So a couple of individuals well known to this community here in Saskatoon came to see us and said, we've got a crazy idea. We know you're going to throw us out, but you need to listen. And they said, we can reduce the search for critical proteins in livestock vaccine discovery research from 12 years to 18 months. And with that, we can take a 5-year development project and develop a new vaccine from scratch for livestock. We threw them out. Go home. Cannot be done. It's good work, but we just don't believe you can do it in the life of a development project. 5 years, cannot be done. We put it out to scientific review. The reviewers agreed. A great idea cannot be done with development assistance. Go find other research money for this. These Saskatoon-based researchers came back to us and said, you're wrong. We can do it. Give us one more chance. So Lauren Hepworth, Stan Blade, a few others, individuals in this room who are responsible for the decision said, take a chance. Do something that governments don't do. Take a risk. Take a bet. So we did. Well, they didn't do it in 5 years. They did it in 6. But they did it. They developed a 5-in-1 multivalent vaccine, one shot, temperature stable, doesn't need refrigeration, doesn't need a cold chain, from scratch for lumpy skin disease, sheep and goat pox, peste de petit ruminant, and I've forgotten what the other two are, lung plague and can't even remember. So to us, that was incredibly impressive. This revelation that something really quite fundamental has changed in how long it takes to do translational research. And what has changed? In this particular case, bioinformatics. They were able to simulate the surface of macromolecules using computer simulations in 18 months, what normally would have taken close to 15 years in searching for proteins. We had not been aware of that dramatic increase in simulation capacity, that bioinformatics was a really key element. And that leads me to almost one of my last slides, and that's, gotta find it, big and open data. You probably don't know, but in separate work we've done over the last 30 years, we've helped to build up open universities, adult education systems that tried to build technical education skills. And increasingly, over the last decade, those have been skills in information technologies and communication technologies. And this field has dramatically taken off. How many times did we hear over the last 2 days about computational biology, about massive new data sets, about the ability to combine enormous amounts of data in completely novel ways. So let me just give you a couple of examples. We've actually funded research that looked at airtime credit purchases as a proxy for food spending in market-dependent households in East Africa. We've looked at work on the Climate Corporation, which is an open data business that offers more accurate insurance and commercial advisory service to help farmers manage and adapt to climate change. So predictive models that failed to give much information about local conditions because they couldn't really be downscaled very effectively, leading to very inefficient risk calculations. Climate Corporation's an open data business that offers more accurate insurance and a commercial advisory service. I think many of you farmers here in rain-fed Western Canada and the US know this very well. I was in Des Moines last year considering could we do more of this kind of work in East Africa, and I was approached by two private sector American businessmen who wanted to work with us to do this in East Africa. Another example, climate smart decision-making tool for Colombian rice growers helped farmers avoid damage from drought. A real strong possibility. Canada is a leader. You may not know it. Canada is a member of the Open Government Partnership, and Canada in that Open Government Partnership, which Obama created with his first executive act when he became president, Canada is responsible for the open data work globally in the Open Government Partnership. And because I'm on camera, I get to say that IDRC is the lead for Canada on open data. So clearly, we believe that open data enables the kind of big data use that can be extraordinarily powerful. Can anyone tell me how many open databases Canada has, the government of Canada has? I can tell you we have more than twice as many as the United States. Open databases. Canada has currently over 200,000 open databases of government data of the Government of Canada. I'm sorry. What can I say? So let me end with pointing out the obvious, which all of you know. Clearly, Canada has an extraordinary advantage in having now built up a genomics platform across Canada. We've been able to demonstrate in the last 6 years that far from being basic and foundational research, this genomics platform in Canada can be combined with research in developing countries to produce scalable transformations on the ground. So we're going to actual regulatory dossiers on the livestock vaccine, 3-in-1 for South Africa, 5-in-1 for Kenya, and I believe it'll be a 4-in-1 for Tanzania. You heard from Teresa about the better yellow potato varieties. They're already at scale. Over 500,000 Colombian farmers have adapted the yellow potatoes. Clearly, there's a whole range of work that can be done both on genomics, on big data, and we believe on last mile technological applications. We are very persuaded that we need research that's excellent and innovative, of course, that's use-inspired, that's about on-the-ground solutions with farmers and along the value chain. And we actually think that there's likely to be more applications for immediate improvements, not on-farm, but post-harvest, particularly in midstream and downstream parts of food chains. We think that it's absolutely critical that the kinds of solutions look at last mile solutions for women and the poor to boost nutrition and incomes. So we've sponsored a whole range of work looking at the gendered implications of changes in livestock markets, for example. We need to connect producers to markets. They're already somewhat connected, but in ways that may not be that helpful for them, and that may require them constantly to upgrade standards using resources they don't have. We need to make a difference at scale. The only way we will overcome skepticism about the value of research to actual changes in people's lives in poor developing countries in the time frame of government-funded projects, not private-funded ones, is if we can do this at scale. So simply doing a project in a village here, a project in a village there isn't going to work. There's all kinds of machines down here. Boy, I could be turning on the cameras. We also need to work with private sectors in developing countries themselves. So not just the Danones, the PepsiCos, the Frito-Lays, the Del Montes. We need to be working with small scale and medium scale farm producers, farm processors, wholesalers, wholesale finance institutions, cold chain operators, and so on. Finally, these need to be sustainable innovations and inclusive. Thank you very much. This is the set of projects that I talk about around the world.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So open it up to questions. There we go.
Anne Rouland from Nestle.
Always a spoil sport.
I do have to challenge you on your description of multinationals with factories in urban areas with no contact to farmers. And this is certainly not the way that we operate. 80% of our factories, that's 400 factories, are in rural areas, employing over 200,000 people, and largely supplied by local raw materials. And we're buying directly from 800,000 smallholder farmers, delivering them training, and we've been doing this for years and years.
Well done.
So if you look
good
at
on you, and keep it up.
Okay. I just can mention that our milk districts, which we started 140 years ago, are now in 30 countries. So this is really continuous for the long term. It's not only in dairy, we're in countries building up new supply chains. In countries like South Sudan, we're starting to build up the coffee industry there. So.
I don't think I suggested whatsoever that international private sector investments aren't needed and valuable, and I certainly think they are. I was only making the point, and horribly it seems, that I think there's a niche for groups that try to build national private sectors, particularly ones that are extremely dispersed across rural and urban areas. And I think that is a role that's not been played that much. I do appreciate your comments, and it's clear that that some companies are very active in this area. So thank you.
So I have a question. I don't have a microphone.
You can come up here. All right.
Sharing your little microphone. So I was really surprised by the data early in your talk that the small farms, the small farmers in rural developing countries, more of their income comes from non-farms. So, and I know you're trying to address that, but what is the implication of that? Are you seeing kind of migration from those farms, leaving them behind, or maybe amalgamation of small farms into bigger farms? Are there trends related to that?
there's all kinds of implications of it. It's clear that households have very much a portfolio approach, with some individuals in the household working in nearby towns, contributing part of their salary to the household, yet others migrating much farther afield and sending back resources as they're able. Equally, some members of the household produce largely for the local household care economy, as it were, right around the house, so they can look after the poultry and the children, and yet others work for market sales in nearby towns, and yet others are integrated into much larger food chains that go to major metropolitan areas through all kinds of different kinds of logistic cold chains and storage and transport systems.
Are there any other questions?
Don't even ask them.